think I'm hit.
Okay, yeah.
My cameraman has been hit. We've also seen tear gas being used. Here we go, they're moving through again.
They don't have another reason why they shoot, and they know we are journalists.
The Office of the Associated Press as its staff made instant decisions about what they needed to salvage to keep on working.
This is the moment an Israeli tank shell struck a group of journalists. The strikes killed Reuters journalist Issam Abdallah and wounded 6 other reporters.
So safety. Safety is possibly the single biggest challenges that are facing newsrooms today. And that includes safety of the sort that we saw there, safety on the ground in conflict zones, but also with urban protests, political rallies, climate disasters, pandemics. And also safety extends not just to people on the ground these days, but it extends also to the people in the newsroom who are editing, receiving, looking through, fact-checking a lot of the images and the information that come into the newsroom. And also it doesn't just cover physical safety, but it covers psychological safety and psychological dangers and how we can mitigate those. So, you know, increasingly we are sort of in safety situations or in risk situations, we are assessing the danger to the journalist, but increasingly the danger to the human being as well. So we're going to talk about how these risks can be mitigated and how newsrooms and editors and then reporters on the ground can mitigate these risks and in conflict zones and beyond. So we have a star-studded panel here of very experienced journalists. Immediately to my left is Elie Brakhya, who is a senior cameraman with Al Jazeera based in Beirut. Ingrid Formanek, CNN executive producer, who's covered almost every war, every conflict, and natural disaster of the past 30 years, from the first Gulf War, including most recently to the recent conflict. Then we have Jeremy Bowen, of course, international star. Everybody here knows him. BBC's international editor, also another veteran frontline correspondent. And Bruce Shapiro, who heads the DART Center. For those of you who don't know the DART Center, it has specialized in trying to mitigate both these physical and psychological impacts of high-risk reporting. So, Jeremy, I'd like to start with you, because earlier today we heard a lot about the dangers and the risks and the horror of reporting in Gaza. You, since the conflict began, have been to Israel several times. You were based in Jerusalem for many years. Can you tell us a little bit about the dangers, physical, emotional, of reporting in Israel as well?
Yeah, and of course we're reporting out of Israel because we can't get into Gaza, though we have tried very hard. Physical dangers, negligible, I'd say, unless you were to go to the West Bank and get involved with some IDF operation or airstrike, or with some of the lawless settlers armed who are there. Minimal physical threat other than that. I think that there is certainly a lot of mental pressure because, I mean, for example, it turns out that quite a lot of people in Israel watch the BBC, and I quite often get people stopping me in the street, or if we're out filming, giving me a piece of their mind, sometimes politely, sometimes not, about different ways in which we're going wrong. I've been accused of anti-Semitism more times than I've had hot dinners. And pressure, too, from social media, if you look at that. I mean, to be honest, I post virtually nothing these days on my X account, because when I look back at it, it just exposes a seam of malice. So I don't really bother with that. But there's certainly, and there's the pressure you get, which is part of the job. I'm not complaining about this, I'm just observing and answering your question. There's a distinct pressure in knowing that everybody's watching everything you do, and every word counts. And people on both sides want to find ways of showing that you're biased, because what they crave more than anything is not impartial journalism, and I do think the word impartial is important. They want an acknowledgement of their victimhood. They want support. They want cheerleading, basically. And that's not our job. You know, it is absolutely not our job to do that. So yeah, you have to navigate through all of this. And one more thing I'd mention is, of course, you know, issues of access. The Israelis gave us a lot of access, or fair access, I'd say, to the border communities that Hamas attacked. I got to Gaza, I was in Ukraine when it started. I got to Gaza, Israel, and the outskirts of Gaza a day or two later. And we had good access to some of those border communities that were attacked. They were still taking out the bodies. One case, there was still fighting going on. And why? Because the Israelis wanted us to see what was there. And we have to conclude that the reason they don't let us in, also the Egyptians, is because there's stuff there they don't want us to see.
So you, second question for you, you know, not to throw your age in your face, but I mean, you've been doing this for a while. You know, in 1989, you covered the civil war in El Salvador. When you think back about when you covered that in 1989 and how prepared you were then, both physically and emotionally, and think forward to how you now go into conflict situation. What's the difference?
Well, it's like a different world. I mean, 1989, we didn't have flak jackets. The idea was you'd look like a soldier and you get shot. In El Salvador, the local journalists who were there had this custom, which I found really alarming, of waving a white flag if they wanted to cross a road during street fighting, shout out periodista, in, you know, journalist in Spanish, and not run but walk across the road. In the hotel, I thought I'll get a bed sheet, I'll get a pillowcase from the hotel as a white flag. I realized in the hotel, the Camino Real, where all the journalists stayed, all the bed linen was yellow because so much had been stolen by journalists. But so, I mean, I thought when I was packing, I was based in Washington, I thought, well, I'll bring my trainers because I might be doing some running. That was about it. I didn't have a Band-Aid, let alone a first aid kit. Now, fast forward many years, the whole health and safety thing has grown no end. And, you know, everybody going there now has various kinds of hostile environments training. We have thousands and thousands of pounds worth of safety equipment, bulletproof Land Cruisers, state-of-the-art flak jackets. We've all got first aid training. If you suddenly had a sucking chest wound, I could help.
I'm so glad to know that.
Yeah, and also a certain amount of psychological support, people ringing up afterwards and saying, are you okay? And that sort of thing. Back when I started, you know, nobody spoke about these things. Nobody spoke about these things because, I don't know, it just wasn't on the agenda.
I mean, Ingrid, you know, you've covered many conflicts, and you have been in a situation to lead others who have been, you know, covering conflicts. And of course, these measures that Jeremy's talking about, many of us, you know, working for mainstream news organizations with a lot of resources for safety, we carry them out and we have them. But of course, then on the ground, things can change, situations can change. How do you handle that situation that can occur even if you're super, super prepared, both physically and in terms of equipment?
Let me step back a bit, because you talked about the flak jackets and sometimes armored cars, if you're part of a news organization that has the resources to support that, training, and let's not think that everybody does that. There's a lot of freelancers, a lot of local journalists or international journalists, as they're also known, who don't have that. But even if you have that, it only gives you X amount of protection. Does it give you a false sense of security? Sometimes it can. However, you go to places where flak jacket, armored car, doesn't do you any good. You go to authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, Iraq, Baghdad.
Iraq, where you go to China, you go to Russia, you're watched. There are places where people are fearful of speaking. There are people who, if you approach them, will be frozen. In Ethiopia, for example, you can't walk up to a person on the street with a camera and a microphone. In one given day, out of 30 people, one spoke to us. She was an American Ethiopian citizen. She had protection. So all this stuff is great that we have, and it's a huge difference, as you say. You know, you had sneakers.
Back then, yeah, Nikes are a good pair. Yeah.
You probably had some vodka too. But anyway, so
you could buy it locally,
to
didn't you?
fortify you. No, but it's a very serious thing. So we can't always rely on this. But when you go into a place, and all places are different, like we just mentioned, safety has to be balanced with editorial. And you're there to get a story, and you're very cognizant of this. But, you know, I'm also cognizant of the fact that Jeremy is really keen to go down that road. Does he really want to go down that road? The road is empty. Everybody's going in the other direction. But you have to make sure that you have not only the physical attributes, what it takes to do the job, but you also need to know your environment, what it implies, who the authorities are, and then what we call local journalists or international journalists. Who are these people? Very often we meet a driver for the first time. Can he drive? Well, I can jump in. But if you speak a language that I don't, or if you're a local journalist and I need to hire you to help me, because they are our eyes and ears. Let's be honest, without local journalists, international journalists, we would be nothing. And hats off to them. But how do you gauge them? And then there's states who will put people in front of you to see if they can, you know, grab you in and influence your thinking, influence your reporting. So it's a very, very complex issue. It's not just as easy as, got an armored car, which is great, which, by the way, the first Chechnya war, the Russian soldiers wanted to test our armored cars with their tanks. So we had to dissuade them from doing that.
But so let me push you on that. So when that situation that you've prepared for, you know, kind of is not exactly the situation that you thought you were going to have, what goes through your mind? Tell us sort of your thought process for yourself, but also for those who are with you or those who you are directing somehow.
Obviously, survival and protection and making it out is your primary concern. It's instinct more than anything else. So you obviously switch from trying to get a story to survive. We had a recent example. I mean, you've had most recent examples. But we're in Afghanistan shortly after the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, and we're driving in. You know, we're wearing the things and trying to fit in and being quiet and in clapped-out cars. You get nabbed in ISIS-K territory. Well, the next thing I know, my colleagues in the clapped-out taxi behind me are thrown into a pickup truck, driven down the road. What do? Yeah, I've got a hell of a good story maybe down the road someplace else, but you got to worry about saving these people's lives and make sure that they don't get taken. So your priorities get switched. And then there's the guy who we met for the first time on the border, half an hour earlier, who we're supposed to trust to get us to Kabul. Now, my concern is him because he's scared to death, probably even more than we are, because he's got pressure on him. He's got families. He's got a tribal thing maybe. He's got a affiliation. So the pressures on the local journalists are enormous. Yes, they are huge on us, and we've lost a lot of colleagues, but we've also lost a lot of journalists who we found in far-fetched places, and we've trusted, and they've very often helped our lives, saved our lives, and helped us do our jobs.
Yeah. Elie, you have had a recent, very harrowing experience. Of course, you were in southern Lebanon together with our Reuters colleague Issam Abdallah and you experienced the same strike in which Issam was killed. And you know, that was a situation in which, seemingly not high risk, many journalists there, something like that happens. What does that say about the help that you then suddenly have to, what happens in that situation? You clearly rely on your colleagues there, and rely on your colleagues. It sort of speaks to Ingrid's point. You can prepare for situations, you have your flak jacket, you're clearly labeled as press as a situation in southern Lebanon, and then something like this happens. What happens on the ground there, and how do you rely on your colleagues to do something to save yourself? I think we have some pictures here of Elie.
When we got at 6:02, I remember that the first rocket or the first attack was straight on Issam. I saw it on my side. I saw him, piece of his body came to us, and Christina from AFP was severely injured. I wasn't injured, I ran. I heard Christina shouting, "What happened? I can't feel my legs." So when I came back, I saw her. I saw Dylan, the other cameraman from AFP. He asked me he need 2 tourniquets because she was severely damaged by both legs. So I told him, just wait 2 minutes, because we always expect 2 shots. This is in the back of our thoughts. Once I turned my back, running behind my car, the second rocket hit us. When you get injured, when you are badly injured, your body will stop. You will freeze. I start asking my reporter, Carmen, is there something on my feet? Because I can't move them. She said, no, you are fine. I was badly injured from sharpener, but she didn't want to worry me more. I lost my shoulder. I couldn't see my eye. I thought I lost my arm, and I thought lost my thumb. And so at the beginning, in my back of my head, from the training you learn, the first aid skills and stuff, it's mostly to help the others more than yourself, because you can do nothing for you. The only thing I could have done is I thought my thumb hanging, I just turned it inside and I closed it. Because maybe we'll save it. And that's it. And I was waiting for the others, for Thaer and Maher from Reuters. They grabbed me from under the car, the burning car, away a little bit more. Then from the locals, from the TV locals and some locals, they knew about us. And then he grabbed me away and the car was burning. So this we were talking about training and the skills and stuff. Even the communication with the community will help you. Because we already set the communication with all the entourage, with all the villages. They knew that we are there. Once someone hear that there's strike over there, everybody will run. So even when I was lying 10 meters away, the only thing I was worried about, because I didn't know how much I was bleeding, when the ambulance will arrive. And because we did our job, we tried to do our job. The funny thing, I was back from Ukraine 3 weeks ago, So I spent 2 years in Ukraine. Nothing happened there. Unfortunately, it happened at my hometown. Yeah. But there's always a third party there's always a high risk chance that other party may target you. Whatever security protocol you did, we did almost everything we know. And that we were clearly identified like journalists.
Yes. This was the strike that killed Issam Abdallah. The journalists were clearly identified as press, and it was 2 strikes from an Israeli tank. Yeah.
And we were lucky that in 15 to 10 minutes, I think that the 15 minutes, the ambulance was there.
And so you all could get to safety.
We got the communication just to be safe.
Let me turn to you, Bruce. We've talked a lot about the physical dangers, but you do a lot of work on the lasting dangers, trauma, PTSD. How has that awareness changed over the years, and what practically do you see that news organizations are doing that you're involved in?
It's a landscape of radical change. And we should say that back when Jeremy, when you were waving your bed sheets to cross the road, it's not only that journalists weren't talking about it, and yes, there was macho swagger, stigma, all that. There also was no data. No one had ever really bothered to ask what happens to journalists who cover violence. And I should say, first of all, most of the crisis correspondents I know do not live up to the stereotype of the profoundly damaged, adrenaline addicted, hopelessly self-medicating, the kind of movie war correspondent. We should establish a norm here. Most conflict correspondents are people with a deep human rights mission, a deep desire to bear witness and tell the world what is happening, who happen through a combination of deep wiring and professional skill be good at the particular sets of decisions and choices and capacities it takes to do that work. We now know, after 20 years of research into journalists all over the world, that we are, first of all, a resilient tribe. Journalists are exposed to far more trauma than the general public at every stage of our careers and in every kind of reporting. It's not just war. Actually, the rates of PTSD, burnout, and so on are lower than you would expect given that. And in part, it's because the job contains some very important resilience factors. Having a job to do, having a strong mission, having ethics, having trusted colleagues. All of these are buffers against the impact of stress and trauma. That said, we also do know from many studies that sometimes a journalist's individual capacity does get overtopped. And then issues like PTSD can be singularly debilitating because they attack the very parts of the brain, the very capacities that journalists rely on every day. To deal with this, news organizations now are engaged in a huge amount of baseline training as part of safety training sometimes, as Jeremy mentioned, sometimes in the form of briefings and trainings for entire news teams. We know the value in particular of collegial support, peer support. So some very important news organizations, including Reuters, have invested heavily in peer support systems backed up by clinicians. We know the importance of access to super qualified mental health care when journalists need it, not because of inherent vulnerability, but in order to stay the course, in order to do the job. And the center that I run, the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, has begun actually training already experienced clinicians in journalist culture and the kinds of issues we tend to bring at the table, so that there is a kind of a baseline capacity for journalists who do need that kind of help. And finally, there's a very important generational change going on. Younger journalists, those coming into the profession now, are bringing their own generational awareness of mental health issues, their own desire for a duty of care by news organizations, for peer support strategies, self-care strategies. And actually, in some ways, I've had to alter my rap in recent years. It used to be that the first few times I went into the BBC, it would be, yeah, there is this thing called PTSD, and it can challenge you, and you want to deal with it. With younger journalists, I'm sometimes having to say, as I did to all of you, actually, we start from a standpoint of resilience. We don't need to assume that just because we're doing difficult work means we're going to end up as mental health casualties, but rather it's about preserving our capacity to do this important work. And I have come to feel that this is a press freedom issue, that a journalist who is disabled by PTSD, who's no longer able to meet deadline, put together a complex story, or otherwise is out of action, is censored as effectively as if imprisoned. So it's not just about, it is about, do we care about the individual journalists who are committing themselves to this work, but it's also about the state of press freedom itself, the capacity of the profession to do the hard work that our colleagues here are doing.
You raise an interesting point, which is there is a misconception, right? That a lot of journalists who are going into war zones are just, sort of cowboys, going in there, for the thrill of it. I mean, there's even a Hollywood movie out there right now, Civil Wars, which I saw, and which portrays the journalists in this way, sort of, never once was it one reporter without even a notebook, never once is there a phone call to an editor, no hat, no flak jackets, anyway. I had an op-ed ready, and then I thought, breathe, count to 10, because it was two Reuters reporters who are represented in the movie. Anyway, but Jeremy, you said you don't just go to wars for the sake of it. And I think you don't remember saying that, but you said it. And I think this gets to the point. And the question I have for all of you really to end, which unfortunately there's not too much time, is when, no story is worth a life, right? When did you have to make that calculus on the ground and you just walked away?
Well, when I was much, much younger, when in my 20s, when I first went to a war, I had that sense that particularly many young men have of being indestructible. And I think at times I was a little bit out of control in that I would be quite happy to go to pretty much, I remember riding through 10-foot high corn in a fiberglass car to get into besieged city in Croatia in 1991, in Vukovar. Things like that, that I would never do now. So that sense of indestructibility departed a long time ago. Well, people always say, well, no story is worth your life. But the fact is, if you go to a war zone, the only way to really make sure in covering a war or a difficult, violent situation is not to go. Stay in your armchair, because you do risk your life. And you just have to accept that. And most people are very happy to accept that because you get a lot of other stuff out of it. Very interesting times, amazing stories, great stimulation, the privilege of being the person who tells the story of the biggest things that are happening in the world that day, which is personally something which I really value. But yeah, I mean, I didn't go to, I've turned down, by the time I had kids, I'd turned down a few stories.
Mm-hmm.
But to be honest, I still struggle to, when people say, why on earth do you do, I still struggle to answer the question because, I'm going somewhere dangerous next week. And the part of me thinks, really? Why? After this length of time?
Ingrid?
Yeah, I ask that question a lot. I've also turned down one assignment and, you question it to the end of your life because this is what you do. And this is what you should be doing, and you feel obligated. But my big thing about turning down is we more and more frequently rely on people in faraway places. Whether you call it social media, whether you call it whatever else, people get information from places that we can't always go to. We can pretty much calculate many risks, not always. There's always bad luck or a bad calculation or bad things happen. But we rely on people who are very far away, who we don't know, we don't see, and these are the journalists we need to support. Is my honest thing. Whether it's Sudan, whether it's Congo, which we haven't talked about much, or even Ukraine and Russia. We focus on a very limited scope because of the corporate world many of us operate in. And there needs to be more scope for, allowing other people and accounting for the dangers that they encounter and supporting them and training them to stay safe and do that job.
Elie, very quickly.
Yeah, the problem is that when you go back safe home, you have the satisfaction. You deliver lots of good messages. You be proud of it. When the time comes, example, when I didn't come back home walking, I was carrying at home. When I see the face of my wife, my mother, my children, and I see this and colleagues, and when you see their faces, you stop for a second. What I've done to do this to all those people? Mm-hmm. Should I stop or no? What should I do? For me, it's a little bit. I'm still in recovery time now, but so far I'm there. I cannot put any one of those. There is people loves you and cares about you. You cannot jeopardize their love and put them in such situations.
Bruce, last word to you. We're very over time, but one piece of pithy advice to those journalists who may be in the audience or who are aspiring journalists. We have a lot of younger, earlier career journalists here who don't have a big organization like ours, who are freelancers. The one piece of advice you would give to protect themselves if they want to do this kind of reporting?
Don't go there.
Get some basic safety training, some basic psychological self-care skills, and look out for colleagues. Build trusting relationships with colleagues. That is the best protection you will ever have.
Great. And on that note of camaraderie, we will end this panel. Thank you very much.
Well said.